All right, we're going to move now to our first session. I'm Ronnie Chatterji, one of the organizers of the conference and a professor here at the Fuqua School of Business. John, before we formally introduce you, I do want to say that if you look at the names on the screen, the institutions behind us within Duke, this part is easy, getting all the different parts of Duke together. And it's one of the reasons it's easy is because of the climate commitment. It's an organizing framework for us to work together on important problems. What is hard is to get several hundred people in a room at 9 a.m. to talk about climate finance. and this is something we stressed about for the last several months as we planned the conference. And so thank you all for being here and being part of this event. We look forward to hearing from you. I'll keep an eye on the iPad if you want to submit questions through Slido. And I'll just start, John, by welcoming you to Duke, but also reflecting on this new title you have. Busy people just get more work on their plate. So when I knew you, you were chief of staff to the President of the United States. Then you founded one of the most influential think tanks in the world, the Center for American Progress. And then when we worked together at the White House, you were the senior advisor to implement the Inflation Reduction Act. What's your new title? And tell us a little bit about what your day-to-day looks like and when you sleep.
I took on some new duties just recently. My new title is Senior Advisor for International Climate Policy. Secretary Kerry had been the president's envoy around the world and done an amazing job of putting the United States back in the lead as an actor to try to deal with the climate crisis, not just in the U.S., but globally. And he was coming off a low base, I have to say, but got America back in the game. We've had a number of successful COPs under his leadership. He is just stepping back. He will do that later next month, I guess, in March, early in March. And I will assume the duties of kind of coordinating the interagency policy on international affairs. So there's quite a bit of work to do, but it makes sense to kind of try to integrate what we're doing at home to try to meet the president's goal and commitment to reduce our emissions by 50 to 52%, which we're going to talk about, through vehicles like the Inflation Reduction Act, the whole of government effort, use of procurement, other activities we're doing, including on the regulatory side. We're about to have some new rules out on in transportation and in the power sector this spring, but to integrate that with our international posture to make sure that people are both learning from what we're doing here. There's a lot of excitement, by the way, around. There's a lot of angst, but there's also a lot of excitement about what the United States is doing to decarbonize its economy. And it has knock-on benefits, I guess I would describe it as. BCG is, for example, estimated that the price of clean energy technology in many of the sectors that we'll discuss will be reduced by as much as 25% by 2030 as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's not just a good thing for the United States, that's really a very good thing for the world, because that means every dollar goes further, there's more deployment. The scale of activity, the scope and pace of deployment needs to accelerate at an exponential level. And I think the United States is doing an amazing job in our own domestic economy, but that's going to have follow-on effects around the world. So I'll be able to bring both those things to bear. I had a little bit of similar role for President Obama, as you know, Ronnie.
That's right.
So I'm excited about it and about to drag my passport back out of the drawer, which I haven't had to use in a while.
Well, let's talk a little bit now on the nitty-gritty of the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, looking at the backgrounds of the people who registered for the conference, you probably have a large percentage of people who are following every rule you release. They're commenting on them. They know the ins and outs. But there's other folks they might know the IRA as a big piece of climate legislation, but not really know what's in it or why it's so important. So talk to us a little bit about, what is the IRA? And particularly when it comes to the private sector, What's been the impact so far?
Look, I think I described the strategy of the Inflation Reduction Act as government-enabled but private sector-led. The biggest investments in the Inflation Reduction Act really work through the tax code. They incentivize people, and I think one of the things that's really quite different from what we've seen over the previous really couple of decades is that you have 10 years of certainty in most of the provisions of the code. There's a little bit of variation in that. But for the most part, you have 10 years of certainty about what you can take advantage of in terms of being able to claim credits. There's a provision that permits you to transfer credits. It gives businesses the opportunity to plan much bigger projects, to plan for the future, to have the certainty that those projects can pencil out. And it's created just a boom of investment. Before I get to that, though, I would say that there's also about $100 billion worth of grants in the Inflation Reduction Act that go to everything from investments in environmental justice to urban forestry across the board. What the IRA did was it tackled every sector, every emitting sector, not just power, but transportation, industry, agriculture and forestry, buildings. So, and it provided support to go from an energy system built on dirty fossil fuels to one built on clean energy. And that's a remarkable sweep of interventions across a broad range of sectors of the economy. But I think we're seeing investments in every one of those sectors. And that's really, I think, exciting because it's a tremendous opportunity for the United States to be able to build on the growth potential of a new clean energy economy. Just throw a few numbers out. Since the president's been in office, we've had $650 billion of announced investments in manufacturing. It's not all the IRA, by the way. It's a suite of bills. Ronnie was with us at the White House and really had a leadership role on putting the structure together for the CHIPS and Science Act, which has driven tremendous investment to reshore our chip manufacturing industry here. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which had major provisions, you'll hear from Jigger and Leslie Biddle later this afternoon, that is investing in demonstration projects to create that cycle of innovation. One of the first things I did when I came back to the government was went to Argonne National Labs with Secretary Granholm because the IRA has major investments in our national lab infrastructure. So that cycle of innovation that's triggered by private sector investment, but also by, as the dean was noting, also by university science, by lab science, et cetera, is really happening across the board, and we can get into some of the details.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. What I'm hearing, I mean, one, I think, comprehensive, right? We're not talking about just one sector that the IRA touches, and the other thing I'm hearing is it's linked to the other things that the Biden administration did, the CHIPS and Science Act, the infrastructure investments. These are all big investments in some way in American manufacturing and climate. The third thing I'm hearing a lot on the business side is it's a lot of tax credits. So a lot of people think of government spending in a way, the government puts out grants, and there is some of that in the IRA, but a lot of this is tax credits that the private sector is going to use to guide their investments if they pencil out. And I think we're really gonna dive deep onto this. One area we're seeing in North Carolina a lot is batteries. Yeah. And we have probably seen 20 big battery announcements in our backyard here in North Carolina over the last year. Are those because of the Inflation Reduction Act? Are they being supported in that way? How should we think about these investments all coming to our state, which seems to be pretty special from what I can tell?
Well, I think you'll hear from Greg Lowe later, who I see sitting in the audience. But I think there's no question that the Inflation Reduction Act has spurred both the reshoring of the supply chain on both electric vehicles and in the solar supply chain. That's challenging, and we should get into that, because the Chinese have come to dominate both of those supply chains over the last decade. It's challenging, but I think it's working. And I think just, again, in the battery and EV space, there's been $160 billion worth of announced investments. That's happening in a battery belt that stretches from Georgia up through Michigan and Kentucky, Tennessee, but certainly in North Carolina and South Carolina, you're seeing major investments. You're feeling it here with Toyota's big announcement in Liberty, $14 billion, I think. VinFast is the big Vietnamese EV manufacturers opening up a facility in North Carolina, in Chatham County. I mentioned Wolfspeed doing silicon carbide, 1,800 jobs, you know, an amazing amount of investment here. And then you have knock-on effects. Just yesterday, there were a couple of other Japanese companies that announced that they're providing to that Toyota factory components that will go into the batteries that are being manufactured there. So we're seeing a lot of foreign direct investment. We're seeing a lot of U.S. company investment. A lot of that's happening in North Carolina. We calculate that there's been about $19 billion of investment in the battery and EV supply chain just in this state. Out of that 160 billion in the country, you're getting a pretty good share of that. So that should be celebrated. And I think more to come, you know. So we're feeling good about that. I think there's been a lot of press recently about are we meeting expectations on the EV penetration rate? But you know, EV sales doubled last year. There's still very strong growth in plug-in hybrid electric vehicles as well. So this is a story. The president set a goal of 50% electric vehicles, new car sales by 2030. I think we're on track to meet that, and that is an opportunity to put a lot of people to work. I mentioned that $19 billion. Climate Power did an estimate of how many jobs have already been created in North Carolina, and this is a few months old. There have already been 5,000 good-paying jobs in this sector created in North Carolina since the Inflation Reduction Act passed. So, as I said, there's momentum behind this. It's a very important component of our overall, you know, Ronnie was chief economist at the Department of Commerce, so he's better able to speak to this than I am. But it's a very strong component of our GDP growth. And I would say one other thing, which I think is both true and interesting, which is all the doom and gloom about recession, that we couldn't squeeze inflation out of the system without throwing a lot of people out of work and throwing the country into recession. I think the Fed has raised interest rates, but we've seen a remarkable ability of the unemployment rate to stay very low. We have a very tight job market. We have strong growth in the United States. It's the envy of the world, by the way, particularly for advanced economies. And we did that and got inflation back into the core level that the Fed looks like, which is just a little bit over 2%. Why did that happen? I think because of these investments. They were, in some ways, a little bit countercyclical to the tightening that the Fed was doing to deal with the inflation that was, you know, in part caused by the supply chain challenges coming out of COVID. But that effect, I'm sitting with a room full of economists, so I'm getting myself in trouble. I'm a jailhouse economist. I just hung around the White House long enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I'm actually a lawyer. But you know, I think you've seen that impact. And so what's the import of that? That means that you know, whether that's the job market, the wage market, where wages are growing faster than inflation, people are living better lives. They're open to opportunities to be in careers that don't require a 4-year. We're sitting in an amazing research university, but don't require a 4-year degree to have a very high-paying, skilled, good job around the country. So that's a virtuous cycle that we want to see keep going.
And let me double click on the battery industry to ask two questions that I hear a lot from industry. One is about the workforce issue and who can get these jobs. And the second one is about the geopolitical environment, which now you have that on your plate as well. On the workforce piece, I talk to folks about these investments and they say, well, I might not be able to get a job there, particularly people you're talking about who might not have a college degree. They might not see themselves working in batteries, EV, lithium processing, which we all have here in North Carolina now. What would you say to those folks? What are the opportunities from the IRA that are going to make the workforce piece click in? Because I think that's a concern for a lot of folks.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. And one of the things we hear from the business community is, where am I going to get, I've got all these investors, where are we going to get the workers? And that really requires, a full response from communities across the country, from state level policy, from the ability of community college, of union training programs, et cetera. It really requires communities to take advantage of their own. These are all, there's not a one size fits all answer to this question around the country, because different communities are going to attract different industries, and the skills that are necessary need to be geared towards those local communities. I have to say that we've tried to be extremely attentive to that in terms of trying to use our workforce training dollars to be able to support investments in of these industries that are coming in the future. The President and First Lady were down at Nash Community College here last summer to just highlight the fact that we've got to gear up for this, starting in high school and all the way through college. But one of the things that's happened as a result of this investment boom, both because of this trio of laws, the Treasury Department just did an analysis, and 86% of investment is in counties with below the medium level of college education. 78% is in counties below the medium wage. So why is that? Well, I think it's in part shaped by by attention to the policy itself. And the dean raised this question about how do you create the enabling environment for that is going to result in kind of good things happening, not just in a few places, but across the country. One of the things the Inflation Reduction Act did was it provides base credits, we've been talking about, to deploy clean power, a very important manufacturing tax credit, 45X, that really is spurring the development of these supply chains here. But these credits across the board have a feature, and particularly in the clean power sector, that you get a bonus if, and this is very thoughtful, it was intended to try to make sure that we didn't just create a lot of jobs, but we created good jobs. So in order to get that bonus, it's 10% of the project costs on the investment tax credit side, as well as on the production tax credit. You have to pay prevailing wage, and you have to use certified apprentices. That has both stimulated the pipeline of apprenticeships to bring people into the system, and it's meant that the jobs being created are being, in communities that have often been left out and left behind, are being supplied with good paying jobs. And, that's what the president wanted. That's why those provisions were included, to not just forget about the fact that you can have investment and growth, but that's not broadly shared. That's running only to the privileged few and not to the bulk of working people in the middle class in the country. So those provisions, I think, are quite intentional to raise the standards of the workforce, to raise the skills of the workforce. And with respect to the grant programs, you'll hear, again, my energy colleagues talk a little bit about this. In order to receive loans and grants, the department is able to ask for and judge applications based on community benefits agreements.
Yes.
So that the question of trying to broaden the diversity of the workforce, to try to ensure that the workforce is able to meet those goals, to attend to issues around environmental justice and whether communities have borne the burden of industrial and power plant pollution in the past. Are we actually cleaning up the air and the water and the surrounding property of communities? Those are all taken into account when Jigger's giving a loan or Leslie's giving a grant. So those things also look to both workforce issues and community issues in trying to, again, ensure that this is producing broad-based prosperity even as we tackle climate change and do this amazing transition from an energy system that's built up over more than close to 2 centuries into one that's going to provide a sustainable future for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing that in North Carolina where, we're used to a lot of investments coming to the Raleigh-Durham area, but you're seeing the battery investments all around the state. Randolph County, Brunswick County, there's some big announcements recently. So by design, the law is trying to spread these investments around, particularly to communities that have been left behind in the energy transition
and
otherwise.
With particular attention to, again, this is, the term just transition has been batted about sometimes positively, sometimes negatively for a long time. It's kind of a top of the mind topic, particularly for our European colleagues. But I think the other enhancement on the credit is to basically to invest in those communities that powered the old system too, energy communities, traditional fossil fuel communities that could have been forgotten in this transition.
That's right.
The credit enhancement is showing that, all across Appalachia, in communities out west, that investment is going to places that really were at the heart of powering our industrial economy over the 20th century. Those investments are going back in this clean energy economy.
That's right.
But again, that was a conscious decision to say that we can't, make this transition on the backs of communities that have traditionally provided those services to the country and to the economy.
This makes a lot of sense. And folks, I'm seeing some folks already submitting, which is great. If you want questions for John Podesta, just submit them and I'll be able to monitor them here. A couple more questions for you on the geopolitical side, because now that you have this new responsibility, we can celebrate these fantastic investments in places like North Carolina, but you have to go abroad and talk to our partners and allies around the world who might be concerned that somehow they're not getting their fair share. Talk to me a little bit about how having both those hats on, which is an interesting position to be in, overseeing the implementation of IRA, but also being our international climate envoy, how these things will interact.
So it's really look, this is an industrial policy. It's intended to invest here in this clean transition, and it's intended to do it in a way that secures our supply chains. I mentioned the China challenge.
Yeah.
And that's a tremendous economic security challenge for the United States. They have so much concentration of supply of these clean energy technologies vested in at best a peer competitor, who are able to manipulate price, they're able to manipulate the supply chain. We've seen them do that in terms of critical minerals, et cetera. So that is not a sustainable position for the United States. So I think it's very conscious. It has raised a challenge with our friends and as well as our competitors, including in Europe and in Asia. I'm about to go to Japan and Korea, and then I'm headed to Brussels and Copenhagen in the next couple of weeks as part of my, kind of new assignment.
The world tour, yes.
I think, look, let me talk about that from a company perspective and then a country perspective. Mm-hmm. I think from a company perspective, you're seeing a lot of foreign direct investment. The Republic of Korea is now the #1 foreign direct investor in the United States, mm-hmm. Both in solar and in autos. You're seeing tremendous investments by...
And chips, too.
And chips, mm-hmm. exactly, by Korean companies here. I think for the most part, that's pretty welcome. And I think for European companies, this is an extremely positive environment to which to make investments. So that has positive effects back in home countries, but it's also, I think from the government's perspective, it's kind of, well, yeah, but what about us?
Right, right.
To which I think we say, the world has to go faster. You need to do this too. You need to incentivize your industry to transition to these sustainable clean energy patterns. And I think that, quite frankly, I think Europe was ahead of the United States before President Biden came back into office. I think we've now leapfrogged what we can imagine happening in our economy. And we're trying to make sure that we do that in a way that that is trying to, with respect to particularly our friends and allies around the globe, does it in a way that meets their issues around these challenges around global supply chains too. So we signed a critical minerals yes. agreement with Japan. We have a free trade agreement with Korea that opens up some opportunities in the critical minerals space to be able to process and import into the United States. We're in discussions. President Biden and President van der Leyen opened up a discussion with the EU. We're in conversations with Norway and other countries about how we can create secure supply chains, boost investment in industries. But quite frankly, I'd like to quote the 2018 IPCC for the climate crowd in here, 1.5 report. And maybe I need to step back a little bit to explain this. When I was with Obama, we were running up to Paris and really putting a lot into it. We were trying to hold global average temperatures to just under 2 degrees Celsius. That was daunting, but that was the goal. That was the global goal. And the Paris Agreement sets that goal, but says we'll try to get as close to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which we will may even pass this year, although it probably will. Mm-hmm. That's kind of an El Nino effect, so it'll probably go back down. It ordered up a study by the global world scientists in the IPCC of what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees C. Why are we talking about these terms? Why are we setting targets in this space? And the degradation of the natural world in that delta between 1.5 and 2 degrees C is massive in terms of loss of food and water supplies, loss of coral reefs, loss of species, et cetera. And that report came out in 2018. It reoriented the whole policy conversation globally towards now not trying to get to 2.5, but to try to get to 1.5, or at least if we're going past it, to have a trajectory that we'd be able to overshoot, maybe come back to 1.5. Why am I saying all that? I'll quote the report. It requires a transformation of the global economy on a size and scale that's never occurred in human history. So for the Duke students in the audience, that's your charge. A transformation of the global economy on the size and scale that's never occurred in human history. From a system built on fossil fuels to one built on clean energy. And we have to do that between now and mid-century to try to get to a net zero goal by 2050, as we've set. China's 2060, India's 2070, but by mid-century, we got to be taking as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we're putting into it to have a sustainable planet. And what that means is huge innovation, huge private sector investment, huge deployment across this range of technologies.
This is exactly why we put together this conference, to kind of raise that challenge for our students.
And that's trillions of dollars of investment.
It's going to take it, right? Now, these are great questions. First, thanks to the audience. Slido is a good technology. I'm just seeing so many good questions, each one, and thank you for such detailed questions. I think, I'm just trying to add up here. Okay, the most common question is one I'll ask you, which is, there's an election this year. and I think the question I can phrase here is that, not about politics, but about durability of the IRA, which is to say, administrations change, politics changes. In the United States, the IRA passed by a narrow margin. The implementation is challenging.
Yeah,
one.
Vote.
I said narrow to give it charitable. I didn't want to,
one
but
vote.
yeah, one vote, exactly.
That was the vice president's vote.
Yeah, exactly. So this is all at a high degree of difficulty. And so for all the folks here who are wondering, can I make an investment against the IRA? For students who are thinking, should I build my career in industries that depend on the IRA? How durable is it? How should we think about that?
Well, look, I think just to put the stakes on the table, there's huge consequence to the election across a whole range of issues, but this is one in particular where you couldn't have different perspectives between the president and the former president, who did everything during his tenure in office to try to reverse what President Obama had tried to do. But having said that, I think the law was put together to be built to last. That 10 years of certainty that I mentioned is being felt in every state in the country, more in red states than blue states. The investments that are happening are very hard to pull up. The communities that are being affected, the jobs that are being created, the industries that are being created, the innovation that's happening across the country is going to be very politically difficult to reverse, no matter what the political structure is going forward. Once you start down this path, it's very hard to make a U-turn and go back, particularly when so much of it is built in to these tax incentives that build their own constituency in the business community, in communities across the country, in the workforce across the country. So I'm very optimistic. And that doesn't mean, look, the new House, the Republican House, has voted 17 times to repeal the IRA. So I'm not naive. But I think while they may try to nibble around the margins, the core of this economic strategy built into the tax code is here to stay. And I think that there's, I of course was around for the healthcare wars and the passage of the Affordable Care Act and the attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Just as the Affordable Care Act, because it was providing such strong benefits to the system and to individual people, very hard to uproot. Now I think that they don't even try anymore. I think this is it's an analogous, maybe it's a bad analogy, I don't know, but I think it's the same in terms of the political economy. It's kind of the same kind of story, which is when people are at work building things we need in this country, doing the work that needs to get done, it's very hard to reverse that.
That's great. I'll take one more question here and then wrap up. Folks want to know what you're going to ask of them. I mean, I think you gave a marching orders to our students, but there's a lot of private sector folks in the room, CEOs at companies, investors. What's your call to action? How should they think about the IRA in how they do their business?
Well, look, I mean, I think there's a lot of participation here by clean energy companies, right? And they know what's in the law, and they talk to me all the time. I would say at the outset, I have a terrific team at my office. A bunch of you know my deputy, Christina Costa, and have dealt with her. Our door's open. We're trying to work through the challenges, whether that's permitting, workforce, which we talked about, supply chains, and to try to get this right. So our door's open. Call us anytime. If you think we've got something wrong in terms of the guidance on the tech side, we're prepared to listen. So the clean energy companies, I think they know their business. They know what is available to them. It's really the rest of the business community that I think needs to pay attention, and not just the business community. I said earlier, just sort of breeze past, these tax credits are transferable. So companies, in terms of their, they should be thinking about this in terms of their investments, particularly their capital investments as they're going forward. Can they generate support for this, and again, across the sectors, including in the industrial sector, that are not just clean energy companies, but are looking to lower the carbon footprint in lower carbon embedded building materials, and across the vast breadth of the economy. Look to the IRA as being a friend, and think about how you could take advantage of it. So that's one thing. Tell the story. That's another thing. If you're taking advantage of those credits, let your employees know that. Let your communities know that. That goes again to the durability question. And then I would just say one other thing, Ronnie. There's a very unique feature in this bill. The president and I were talking about this. Very unique feature. It's a little bit of a vestige of it or a precursor of it in President Obama's Recovery Act. But this is a kind of full-blown version of what we call direct pay. And our friends at the Treasury Department called elected pay for reasons that I still don't know. But most of the world calls it direct pay. And what it does is it gives states, cities, counties, nonprofits, hospitals, Duke University, community colleges, school systems, the ability to invest in clean vehicles, in rooftop solar, in certain kinds of investments in energy systems. And in the past, those credits were, to the extent they're precursors to the credits I'm talking about, were only available to the private sector. Now they're available through this vehicle, through this feature called direct pay, to nonprofits, churches, whatever. They can invest. They're not federal tax-paying entities. They go through a process which is pretty simple. File a piece of paper with the IRS and get a check back for what could be 40-60% of the cost of deployment. So that's an extremely powerful tool. Particularly for maybe don't think of Duke as a nonprofit, but it's a big nonprofit. The hospital is a big nonprofit. So they're players in this game. So I wanted to mention that because I think this is pretty new. I think people aren't thinking about that as much. And the ability to deploy at scale across the country, across the sectors in the economy is just amazing in this law.
And this is great, John. And you've laid the foundation for the rest of the day, where we'll hear from CEOs of some of the companies that are making those decisions in the energy space, from private equity investors who are raising funds around this, from venture capital investors who are making investments in new startups, to philanthropic leaders, as well as university leaders. So you're going to hear perspectives from all of them. For now, though, John, I just want to thank you for joining us at Duke today. It's fantastic to have you. We wish you the best in your new and amazing job, and we really appreciate your time to come down to Durham.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.